Hi, my name is Syd Holtzapple, and for the past few weeks I have been researching the impact of civil liberties and national security. Because for ages now, the government has always been faced with the difficult decision of whether or not to curb civil liberties in order to provide for national security. From Abraham Lincoln's suspension of habeas corpus during the Civil War to the more recent Patriot Act passed after 9/11, this theme of protecting the people versus protecting the people's rights has been an issue present throughout American history. And this theme continues to manifest itself through Francine Prose's article, When Librarians Are Silenced, as she discusses the arrest made at a public event for no reason other than probable cause. And while the police involved were merely trying to protect the people there, they went ahead and violated the rights of the citizen for arresting him for no reason other than his background. The artist Banksy goes on to further this idea as he depicts the government always being involved in the private lives of citizens, always being there. And Banksy goes on to kind of demonstrate how the government goes beyond necessary measures to ensure national security. And because of this, I began to wonder about the balance between security and liberty in America. Having always been interested in history and events involving Americans, I questioned to what extent does the presence of a national crisis impact the civil liberties of Americans. And in short, the presence of a national crisis causes Americans to hand over liberties that would not necessarily be an issue under normal circumstances, and also causes the government to hand over these civil liberties for this illusioned idea of national security. Looking more in depth, we realize that it can be concluded that giving up liberties is illogical based on historical patterns, although it can be a necessary solution to a national crisis depending on the severity of the situation. And overall, national security and civil liberty must exist together in order to be effective. And this starts by looking into illogicality, because America was founded based on this idea that all men are created equal and are entitled to this right to these certain unalienable rights guaranteed to them by their Constitution. And so in theory, the presence of a national crisis should not cause any man to give up his rights no matter what. And Carol Lewis, professor of political science and public administration at the University of Connecticut, addresses this and proclaims that people tend to view crises different at the general level versus the personal level. Now, this is important because public perception of a national crisis ultimately determines how they will go about solving this problem. And so if people don't necessarily understand what's going on around them, they're led to these illogical conclusions as to what's going to guarantee them this sense of safety. And Lewis also goes on to present this sort of trade-off, and in the presence of a national crisis, people believe that they can only have one or the other, being national security or civil liberties, but they cannot have both, which isn't always true. And we see that this idea of illusion over logical reasoning, which is the foundation of this whole crisis to begin with, which isn't always correct. So we look further into this idea that sacrifice should be based off of severity, because not all national crises that arise are as severe as another. So, for example, 9/11 put terrorism on the board as one of the most important problems facing society today, and created this whole idea of mass hysteria. People were going crazy and didn't know what to do because this had never happened before. And Richard Posner, a law professor at the University of Chicago and former judge on the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Seventh Circuit, argues that prioritizing liberty is the foundation of this issue, because putting one above the other creates this sort of mass hysteria. People don't know what's going on. And because of his experience in the field, Posner ultimately states that if it is true that the events of September 11th have revealed the United States to be in much greater jeopardy, it stands to reason that our civil liberties will be curtailed. And they should be curtailed to the extent that the benefits in greater security outweigh the costs in reduced liberty. So what's he saying? He's saying that The severity of the situation ultimately determines the people's choices. So, while it may be illogical at some times to give up your national rights in order to feel a sense of safety, it is not always the right decision, and that the sense of security can only come based on the severity of the situation. And having that said, between the illogicality of giving up civil rights, but also the severity of the crisis at hand, the overarching truth is that both civil liberties and national security must exist together. They can only exist together because in order to have one, you have to have the other. In order to have both, you must have both. And Fred Imbaugh, head of Northwestern University Criminal and Law Department and founder of the AELE, a research-driven educational organization that produces and disseminates legal information, addresses how enforcers of law need to adhere to civil liberties, yet civil liberties also need to adhere to law enforcement in order for both to be effective. And he does this through his research on the Mapp versus Ohio case and the exclusionary principle, and comes to the conclusion that both are needed because he predicts that in future court decisions, the Supreme Court decisions, will ultimately disable police from soliciting confessions from victims or from suspects without the due process of law. And by doing this, the Supreme Court would ultimately be counterproductive in curbing national conflicts because they would be prohibiting police the necessary means to acquire data and make arrests. Because of this, we can see that in order to have one, you must have the other. By eliminating national security, you eliminate your civil rights. By eliminating civil rights, you eliminate your national security. In order to have both, you must have both. And Imbaugh kind of addresses this, and he explains how they must adhere to each other in order for both to exist. And he draws this thin line between the balance of national security and civil liberties, which ideally, in order to keep liberties from being reduced too far, a legislation should be passed, defining strict guidelines as to what the government can and can't do in times of national crisis. Now, this legislation would have to include the proper checks and balances regarding mass hysteria, regarding national crisis standards, and regarding the situation in order to be productive and effective in curbing the mass hysteria that is generated by a national crisis. However, according to the American Government Online Textbook, less than 10% of bills actually become laws based on the intensive process it must go through. And because of this, it would be highly unlikely that a law of such intensive measures would actually be put into effect. And from here, we realize that a more reasonable way to go about addressing this balance between security and liberty is to reform how government and national conflicts are taught in schools, because younger generations are the future to learning from our past mistakes, and by reforming how it's taught in schools ultimately will lead to more educated decisions about civil liberties.